Assalamu alaikum, fam. Hope you're doing well. So, we are continuing this book by Hegel. He is a German philosopher. Now, he's a little difficult to understand for many. I mean, for people who are experienced in philosophy, who can follow his rhetoric, it's not as hard. But, if you begin to see his way of writing, you'll bust it out pretty quick. He has his own form of Hegelian logic. A lot of people talk about him, but they haven't actually read him. So, as I always say, read the original sources for yourself in addition to hearing other people give their perspective, especially concerning Hegel. He's quite a heavy-duty dude, right? And it is originally in German, but they translated it to English, so subhanAllah. We'll try to do our best. And this is number 96. Okay? Let's begin. The now that is night is preserved, i.e., it is treated as what it professes to be. So, preservation, treated as what it professes to be, as something that is. So, if it's preserved, it is, right? But it proves itself to be, on the contrary, something that is not. Maybe because the now that is night, so the night is not day. Let's see. The now does indeed preserve itself, but as something that is not night. So the now does indeed preserve itself, but as something that is not night. Equally, it preserves itself in the face of the day that it is now. Okay, so notice this. Something that is not the night, and then preserves itself until day shows up, and that day takes it over. So it sounds like a very complicated way of saying the night has this temporary spot, and that it's just on the opposite of day. So he has a very wordy way of saying it. As something that also is not day. In other words, as a negative in general. So that the night is the negation of day. So night is preserved. It's something that is, but is also something that is not. Well, logically, yes, right? So it is not day. It's in that temporary moment of what is. And because it's continual, it's preserved, right? This self-preserving now is, therefore, not immediate, but mediated. Notice this difference here. So the now is self-preserving, and it's a mediated entity type of force. It's not immediate. It's gradual, because the night and day is in of itself gradual. It is determined as permanent and self-preserving now, through the fact that something else, viz., day and night, is not. So both of them are not the other. And they become not the other through the fact of this self-preserving now, this continual flow. As so determined, it's still just as simply now as before. Look at that. It's simply now as before. Go ahead and say that to somebody next time you're talking to them. Like, where it is now as before. It's like, what? And in this simplicity is indifference to what happens in it. So the simplicity of the now as before is indifferent to what actually happens to it. Just as little as night and day are its being, just as much also is its day and night. It is not in the least affected by this its other being. So the night and the day are not affected by each other in the least. So essentially, they are just being in of themselves, which we pretty much understand. A simple thing of this kind, which is, through negation, which is neither this nor that, and not this. So, this or that. So there's like almost this middle ground of like the day and the night, almost sounds like he's saying. And this is with equal indifference, this as well as that. So this and that have the same level of indifference. Such a thing we call universal, So it is in fact the universal that is the true content of sense certainty. So sense certainty is in fact the true universal, he argues. So the thing he calls the universal is something that is also this as well as that, and it's equal in its indifference. Also, something that comes through negation, and that negation is not something that isn't affected in the sense of its being. Well, very nerdy, I have to say. 97. It is a universal, too, that we utter what the sensuous content is. What we say is this, i.e., the universal this. So notice how he said universal this, or it is, i.e., being in general. So when we say it is, we are thinking of being in general. Yeah, when you say something like it is this way, it is that way, you're speaking in a generality. It's assumed, right? Of course, we do not envisage the universal, this or being in general, but we utter the universal. Yes, that's a good point. So we're not envisioning it within our minds to have this sort of being in general, but we utter it. In other words, we do not strictly say what is in this sense certainty we mean to say. Yeah, I mean, we don't strictly say it. We don't, unless someone says, oh, strictly speaking, X, Y, and Z, right? But language, as we see, is the more truthful. In it, we ourselves directly refute what we mean to say. yeah, that's kind of true, right? Like, well, what I meant was, so you said, you uttered it, and then you had to clarify it. So it's very true. And since, that's funny. And since the universal is the true content of sense certainty. So remember over here, he said, in fact, the universal that is true content of sense certainty. Now he said here, the universal is the true content of sense certainty. So he's repeated that twice. And in language expresses this true content alone. So language expresses the true content of sense certainty, because we utter it and then we clarify it. And we speak in generality when we mean to say it. It is just not possible for us ever to say or express in words a sensuous being that we mean. So, wow, he's saying that it is true that we do use our language to expound upon universals and sense certainty, but at the same time, we won't be able to find the words that will express our sensuous being of what we really mean to say. So words cannot describe what we mean. You've heard that before. No lie, you've heard that before. It's like he has this way of like bringing it all out, right? 98. The same will be the case with the other form of this with here. So he's getting into here, and he's getting into this. So this is very language oriented. I feel bad for the person who had to translate it. Here is, e.g., the tree. If I turn around, this truth has vanished and it is converted into its opposite. Okay, let's think about that. If I say, here is the tree, and if you turn around, the truth has vanished. Let's see if he means by you no longer perceiving it, or by you looking at it and then your sense perception comes in. And it's converted into its opposite. So by looking, let's see if he means by looking away from it or for it, that converts it to its opposite. No tree is here, but a house instead. Okay, so he's looked away from the tree and has seen a house. Here itself does not vanish, on the contrary, it abides constant in the vanishing of the house, the tree, etc., and it is indifferently house or tree. Again, therefore, that this shows itself to be a mediated simplicity or universality. So here it appears he's getting into a bit of what the word here does. So it appears he's trying to tell us, someone says, here's a tree, but at first you look for the tree and you don't perceive it, and then you look at the house, and then it's like the tree has vanished in its truth. It's still there, but your perception of it is off. And now you're indifferent to what was even there. So that this has then become a sort of mediated way of you looking around and identifying the universality. This is a very trippy guy, isn't he? So he first told us about the now that is night is preserved, and how something that also is not day, night, there's these negatives, and that there is a self-preserving now, but that now is not immediate but mediated. So notice how he said the now is mediated, and then here he said the word here is a mediated simplicity or a universality. Then he contended that this and that are something that help you to identify a thing that you would call a universal, and that universal is the true content of sense certainty. So the sense certainty is this or that, and then he contends that here also is a way of seeing truth vanishing and converting to its opposite. So here he had the negation, and then here he had the opposite. Both negation and the opposite are similar. So he is very sassy-frassy, and I gotta say, he goes about wording what he wants to word in a very, like, woo way, but you'll get it. You'll get it, inshallah. He continues in 99, pure being remains, therefore, as the essence of this sense certainty. So pure being is going to remain when sense certainty is present. The essence is going to stay there. Since sense certainty has demonstrated in its own self that the truth of its object is the universal. So sense certainty demonstrates for you that the object's truth is its own self, universally. But this pure being is not an immediacy, so it's not immediate. That pure being might not be perceived by you immediately due to your senses, but something to which negation and mediation are essential. So you're going to see in the negation or a mediation that is going to help you see the immediacy of that object's truth in its universal sense. Consequently, it is not what we mean by being, but is being defined as an abstraction. So being defined as an abstraction. So the abstraction is quite different than what you mean, because if you're abstracting, it's not exactly what you mean. You're trying to get to what you mean by abstraction, you see? Or as the pure universal in our meaning, for which the true content of sense certainty is not the universal, is all that is left over in face of this empty or indifferent now and here. So the now and the here has an empty space that's left over that is also indifferent. So here he said that the true content of sense certainty is not the universal. So he seems to really dig into the abstraction point versus what you mean, and then pure being not always being an immediacy in your comprehension, that you can have something that is a negation or a mediation for you to get to that sense certainty, and that it's not always universal, that you'll perceive the essence of the sense certainty, but even though you don't, the pure being still remains. So here you get a long-winded explanation, an example of what he feels that the words this, here, and night and day do. Very nerdy. Hope your head doesn't hurt. Don't worry, fam. You'll be just fine, okay? You're just fine.